In 1991, at just 32 years old, Magic Johnson walked into a packed press room and ended an era in one sentence: he had HIV. At that time, the average life expectancy after diagnosis was less than 10 years. Many believed it was a death sentence. But how many people know what happened before that microphone, inside the doctor's office, during the first 24 hours when Magic believed his life was already over? Most people think legends are untouchable. They're not. This is how a king of the 80s went from invincible to learning how to survive day by day. The press conference was not the moment everything fell apart. It was the moment after the damage was already done. The real collapse happened earlier, inside a quiet doctor's office, when Magic Johnson heard a word that erased his future in seconds: HIV. In the late 1980s, that word carried a single meaning: death. No timeline. No certainty. Just waiting. He didn't panic. That came later. At first, there was only silence. A long, heavy pause where his mind ran faster than his body. He had seen what HIV did to people. Weight loss. Hospital beds. Funerals that came too soon. In his head, the calculation was brutal and immediate. 32 years old. Maybe 5 years left. Maybe less. Driving home, he didn't turn on the radio. He didn't call anyone. Every mile felt unreal. That night, sleep never arrived. He stared at the ceiling, replaying choices he could not undo. He thought about his wife. About the child she was carrying. He wondered if love itself had already become something dangerous. Fear blended into guilt. Guilt hardened into shame. The scariest part wasn't the thought of dying. It was the image of the world moving on without him. Games still played. Arenas still full. His name slowly reduced to a cautionary tale people whispered about when they thought no one was listening. By morning, nothing felt heroic. He didn't feel strong. He felt exposed. He knew the league might push him away. He knew fans might be afraid to even stand near him. He understood that once the truth came out, there would be no way back. And somewhere in that fear, a quiet realization surfaced. If time was now limited, hiding would only waste what remained. Silence would not protect him. It would erase him. Long before the lights, the contracts, and the illusion of being untouchable, Magic Johnson was just a kid growing up in Lansing, Michigan. He was born in 1959, the sixth of 10 children in a working-class family where nothing came easy and nothing was guaranteed. His father worked long shifts at General Motors. His mother cleaned classrooms at a local school. Money was tight, time was tighter, and excuses were not part of the household language. Their home was loud, crowded, and disciplined. You learned early how to share space, how to wait your turn, how to carry responsibility even when you were still a child. There was no fantasy about greatness. Life was practical. You worked. You helped. You stayed in line. That environment built resilience before it ever built confidence. When Magic was still young, tragedy hit without warning. His father collapsed at work and died suddenly. One moment, the center of the household was there. The next, he was gone. The family didn't have time to grieve the way movies show. Bills still came. Food still needed to be on the table. His mother kept going, not because she was strong, but because stopping was not an option. That loss etched something permanent into Magic's understanding of life. Things could end instantly. Stability was fragile. As a child, he wasn't the tallest. He wasn't the strongest. But he was observant. He watched how adults handled pressure. He saw how silence could hide pain. And he learned early that showing fear didn't change outcomes. It only slowed you down. Basketball entered his life quietly, not as a dream, but as an outlet. It was something he could control in a world where so much had already been taken away. On the court, movement replaced confusion. Rhythm replaced grief. Passing the ball gave him a sense of connection that real life had fractured. The game rewarded awareness, timing, and trust. Traits he had already been forced to develop at home. By high school, his talent became impossible to ignore. He wasn't just scoring. He was elevating everyone around him. Coaches noticed something unusual. He played like someone who needed the team more than the spotlight. That came directly from his upbringing. In a house of 10 children, you either learned to work with others or you disappeared. But even as his name spread locally, there was no sense of entitlement. Fame wasn't discussed at the dinner table. Survival was. His mother made sure of that. She held him to standards that didn't bend just because he could play basketball better than anyone else in the room. Discipline at home never loosened. That grounding mattered more than anyone realized at the time. Because years later, when success arrived too fast and too loudly, when adults stopped saying no and replaced guidance with admiration, the internal structure built in Lansing was the only thing that didn't completely collapse. There were early warning signs, though. As attention grew, so did the belief that opportunity had no consequences. That talent could shield behavior. That life would keep forgiving choices. Those ideas didn't come from his childhood. They came from leaving it too early. What Lansing gave him was not innocence. It gave him endurance. It taught him how to stand inside pressure without immediately breaking. It showed him that love could exist without comfort, and that loss could arrive without explanation. Those lessons didn't prevent future mistakes. But they planted something deeper. A core that would later be tested in ways no coach, no contract, and no championship could prepare him for. Because when the diagnosis came decades later, and the noise of the world fell away, what remained was not fame or fear. It was the quiet memory of a household that survived the impossible by refusing to stop. Magic didn't enter basketball chasing fame. It came to him faster than he could understand what it demanded in return. By the time he left Lansing for college, the game had already labeled him as something rare. Not just talented, but magnetic. People watched how others moved when he stepped on the court. Teammates played freer. Crowds leaned forward. Coaches trusted him without hesitation. At Michigan State, everything accelerated. The pressure, the expectations, the belief that he was already destined for something bigger. He delivered almost immediately. In 1979, he led his team to a national championship, facing another young star who would later define an era alongside him. The game wasn't just a victory. It was a statement. He wasn't a prospect anymore. He was ready. The NBA didn't ease him in. It dropped him straight into the center of the storm. Drafted first overall by the Los Angeles Lakers, he entered a league desperate for revival and attention. And from the start, he was treated less like a rookie and more like a solution. The cameras followed him. The city embraced him. The expectations were not gradual. They were absolute. Success arrived so quickly that there was no time to build boundaries. He won championships almost immediately. He filled arenas. He became the face of a new style of basketball that felt joyful, fast, and effortless. Off the court, the same momentum followed him. Invitations came without limits. Access was unlimited. No one questioned his decisions. No one told him to slow down. This was the dangerous part. Not the fame itself, but how it rewired consequences. When you win early and often, failure feels theoretical. Risk starts to feel optional. The lifestyle around him normalized excess. Being young, rich, and admired created an illusion that nothing carried long-term cost. Pleasure didn't feel reckless. It felt earned. There were no mentors pulling him aside to talk about restraint. The people around him benefited from his momentum. The league benefited. The city benefited. Silence became a form of permission. What wasn't said mattered as much as what was celebrated. On the court, he remained disciplined. Focused. Relentless. But off the court, the structure that once defined his life began to loosen. The routines of Lansing were replaced by a rhythm dictated by wins, travel, attention, and indulgence. Each season blurred into the next. Championships stacked up. So did habits no one wanted to examine too closely. From the outside, this phase looks like a dream. And in many ways, it was. But dreams rarely come with instructions. And when success arrives before self-awareness, it teaches the wrong lessons. That being exceptional means being exempt. That tomorrow will always arrive untouched by today's choices. There were moments when reality tried to interrupt. Fatigue. Quiet doubts. Passing thoughts about responsibility. But they never stayed long. There was always another game. Another celebration. Another reminder that he was winning at a level most people never reach. This period didn't feel like a mistake while it was happening. That's what made it dangerous. Nothing collapsed. Nothing demanded immediate correction. Life kept rewarding him. And when life rewards behavior consistently, it trains you to repeat it without reflection. Years later, when everything stopped in a doctor's office, this stretch of time would replay itself in his mind with brutal clarity. Not as regret, but as understanding. Understanding that no downfall begins with one moment. It begins with a long stretch where nothing seems wrong. By the time the world would ask how this could happen to someone like him, the answer would already exist in these early years. In the speed of success. In the absence of limits. In a career that exploded before the person inside it had time to catch up. By the early 1980s, Magic Johnson was no longer becoming a star. He was redefining what a star looked like. Basketball stopped feeling like a sport and started feeling like a spectacle built around his presence. The Lakers didn't just win. They entertained. Fast breaks became theater. Smiles became trademarks. Championships arrived not as surprises, but as expectations. Titles came early and often. Finals appearances stacked up. Awards followed. Money multiplied. Endorsements turned his face into a symbol far beyond the court. In a decade hungry for icons, he fit perfectly. Confident. Charismatic. Larger than life. He wasn't just playing in the NBA. He was helping sell it to the world. The media loved the story. A joyful leader. A winner who made everyone around him better. Headlines focused on brilliance, not cost. Success was framed as destiny, not effort. As if this outcome had always been guaranteed. That narrative erased struggle and replaced it with inevitability. What fans didn't see was how quickly life stopped offering friction. Every environment adjusted to accommodate him. Schedules bent. Rules softened. People laughed at things they would have questioned in anyone else. Admiration blurred into permission. And permission, when unchecked, quietly becomes danger. The lifestyle matched the fame. Nights became longer. Cities blurred together. Privacy disappeared, but accountability never replaced it. The attention never shut off. Everywhere he went, doors opened without hesitation. There was no need to plan, to think ahead, to consider consequences. Everything felt available. And availability became normal. On the surface, he remained disciplined where it mattered most. Practices were intense. Games were focused. He showed up when it counted. That consistency convinced everyone, including himself, that control extended to every part of his life. If he could manage pressure on the biggest stages, why would anything else be different? The problem with that logic is that control on the court does not translate to control everywhere else. But no one challenged the illusion. The culture around him didn't reward caution. It rewarded excess masked as confidence. As championships accumulated, so did the belief that he was untouchable. Not in words, but in behavior. Losses didn't linger. Mistakes were absorbed by success. The future felt endless. 32 didn't feel like a limit. It felt like a checkpoint on a much longer road. There was also a darker silence beneath the celebration. Conversations that never happened. Questions that were never asked. Health was not discussed. Risk was not acknowledged. The era itself didn't encourage it. In the 1980s, conversations about personal responsibility, sexual health, and long-term consequences were avoided, especially for men at the top. Ignorance wasn't accidental. It was cultural. The league benefited from the image. The city benefited. Sponsors benefited. Nobody wanted to interrupt a story that was working so well. And when a system benefits from your momentum, it rarely warns you when you're moving too fast. From the outside, this period looks flawless. A decade of dominance. Smiling photos. Trophy ceremonies. Parades. But perfection on camera often hides neglect behind the scenes. Not intentional neglect. Just unattended areas of life slowly accumulating risk. This was the peak. Not just of success, but of belief. Belief that tomorrow would always arrive intact. That the body was resilient. That consequences were for other people. That warning signs belonged to stories that happened elsewhere. What makes this phase essential to understand is not the celebration, but the absence of interruption. Nothing forced reflection. Nothing demanded a pause. The machine kept moving, and he moved with it. When people later asked how someone so successful could face such a sudden collapse, they often looked for one reckless night or one fatal decision. But the truth was more uncomfortable. The collapse didn't come from a single moment. It came from years where success removed friction, where silence replaced guidance, where everything worked too well for anyone to stop and ask what might happen next. This was not a fall waiting to happen. It was a fall that had already been quietly prepared. By speed. By access. By a culture that celebrated the image of being unstoppable, without ever asking what happens when the body finally proves otherwise. And when that proof arrived, it didn't arrive gradually. It arrived all at once. In a room with no cameras. With a diagnosis that didn't care about trophies, fame, or history. That was when the illusion ended. The diagnosis didn't just change his future. It rewrote his present overnight. When the news became public, the world reacted exactly the way he feared it would. In 1991, HIV was still surrounded by panic, misinformation, and moral judgment. People didn't ask how he felt. They asked what he had done wrong. Fear moved faster than facts. For Magic Johnson, the most immediate loss wasn't money or status. It was proximity. People hesitated to shake his hand. Some avoided standing too close. Others spoke softly, as if he might break, or worse, contaminate the room. The same smile that once drew crowds now created distance. Not because people hated him, but because they were afraid. The NBA reacted cautiously, then decisively. His career stopped. Not slowly. Not ceremonially. It ended because the league didn't know how to handle the situation, and fear filled the gap where understanding should have been. The game that had structured his entire adult life disappeared in a moment. No locker room. No travel schedule. No sense of normalcy. Just empty days where noise used to be. At home, the silence grew heavier. Every sensation became suspicious. Fatigue felt like a warning. A cold felt like a countdown. In that era, treatment options were limited and brutal. Medications came with harsh side effects and uncertain results. Survival wasn't framed as a plan. It was framed as hope, and hope felt thin. The psychological weight was relentless. He began to measure time differently. Not in seasons, but in checkups. Not in years, but in lab results. He prepared himself for decline. For weight loss. For public pity. For becoming an example of what happens when success collides with reality. Then came the guilt. The kind that doesn't announce itself, but settles quietly and refuses to leave. He questioned every past decision. Every relationship. Every moment where he had assumed tomorrow was guaranteed. The realization was simple and devastating. Talent does not negotiate with biology. Fame does not delay consequences. Media narratives shifted quickly. The same outlets that once celebrated his lifestyle now framed his illness as a cautionary tale. Subtle judgment replaced praise. Sympathy came with distance. Curiosity came with speculation. He wasn't just a person anymore. He was a headline, a symbol, a conversation people had about risk without ever asking how it felt to carry it. Inside, he struggled with something even heavier than fear. Identity loss. Basketball wasn't just a job. It was how he understood himself. Without it, there was a void he didn't know how to fill. He woke up without purpose and went to sleep without relief. The routine that had once exhausted him was gone, and in its place was too much time to think. There were days he questioned whether survival even mattered. Not in a dramatic sense. In a practical one. What kind of life would remain if the world only saw him as fragile, contagious, or already gone? What future could exist when society expected him to fade quietly? Friends tried to help, but many didn't know how. Some stayed away, unsure of what was safe to say or do. Others hovered, their concern heavy and uncomfortable. Privacy vanished. Every public appearance became a test. Every interview became an autopsy of a life that wasn't over yet. The darkest realization came slowly. He wasn't just fighting a virus. He was fighting perception. Ignorance. Fear. A narrative that had already written his ending without asking his permission. That fight was exhausting in a way championships never were. Yet beneath the weight, something resisted collapse. Not optimism. Not confidence. Just refusal. A quiet resistance to disappearing on someone else's terms. He began to understand that if he remained silent, the story would finish itself. And it wouldn't be kind. This was not the moment of transformation. That comes later. This was the lowest point. The phase where survival felt uncertain, dignity felt negotiable, and the future felt like a room with the lights turned off. Where every step forward required energy he wasn't sure he still had. And still, even here, something shifted. Not outwardly. Internally. A slow realization that waiting to die was not the same as living. That fear, if left unchallenged, would take more than his health. It would take his voice. This realization did not bring peace. It brought tension. Because choosing to speak, to stand visible in a world that wanted to look away, would demand more courage than any final shot ever had. The shock didn't fade. It spread. Across locker rooms. Across living rooms. Across a country that still didn't know how to talk about HIV without fear. Overnight, Magic Johnson became a public lesson people argued about instead of a person trying to survive. Parents worried about their children watching games. Players wondered if sharing a court was safe. Rumors replaced facts, and distance replaced empathy. Some reactions were quiet. A step back. A handshake that didn't happen. Others were loud. Calls to keep him away from the league. Questions about locker room safety. Debates that treated his body like a risk assessment instead of a human life. The message was clear even when it wasn't spoken. You are different now. You are dangerous now. The league tried to manage the moment, but management wasn't enough. Fear doesn't wait for policy. It fills the space immediately. His absence became permanent before anyone called it that. Basketball, the structure that once defined his days, was gone. And without it, the days stretched long and shapeless. The media cycle fed the anxiety. Every update turned into speculation. Every appearance was examined for signs of decline. People counted time instead of listening to words. Survival became a spectacle. He felt watched, not supported. Studied, not understood. What hurt most was realizing how quickly admiration could turn conditional. The same society that celebrated his joy now needed reassurance that he wasn't a threat. The same fans who once felt closer to him now needed distance to feel safe. Fame didn't disappear. It mutated. At home, the pressure compounded. Protecting his family became an obsession. He controlled who entered the house. He limited contact. He monitored his own movements, his own health, his own thoughts. Love began to feel fragile, something that could be harmed by proximity alone. That fear was heavier than the virus itself. There were moments he considered retreat. Living quietly. Letting the world move on. Accepting the role of a tragic footnote. It would have been easier. Less confrontational. Less exhausting. Silence offered safety from judgment, even if it also guaranteed erasure. But silence came with a cost. Every time misinformation spread unchecked, it hardened. Every time fear went unchallenged, it multiplied. He watched the narrative shape itself without him, and he recognized something familiar. It was the same dynamic he had seen growing up. When people don't understand, they fill the gap with assumptions. And assumptions become walls. This was the social shock. Not the diagnosis. The realization that the fight was bigger than his body. That survival alone wouldn't be enough. Even if he lived, the story being told about him would decide how he lived. Gradually, a shift began. Not dramatic. Not public. Internal. He started asking different questions. Not, how long do I have, but, what happens if I don't speak? Not, how do I avoid attention, but, who benefits if I disappear? He began educating himself. About the science. About transmission. About the myths driving fear. Knowledge replaced some of the panic. Understanding didn't cure him, but it armed him. For the first time since the diagnosis, he felt something other than dread. He felt responsibility. Responsibility not as punishment, but as purpose. If the world was going to talk about HIV, then someone had to talk back with facts instead of fear. If people were going to look at him anyway, then he would decide what they saw. This didn't feel like bravery. It felt necessary. The same instinct that once drove him to control the court now pushed him to control the narrative. He understood competition. He understood pressure. And he understood that retreat would mean losing a game he couldn't afford to lose. The turning point didn't arrive with applause. It arrived quietly, in the decision to remain visible when invisibility was safer. To correct lies instead of letting them stand. To redefine strength in a culture that equated illness with weakness. That decision didn't solve the problem. It created a new one. Speaking out would invite scrutiny, criticism, exposure. But it also opened a path forward. Not back to the past, but into a future he could still influence. This was the bridge. Between fear and action. Between being defined and defining himself. between waiting for time to run out and choosing how that time would be used. From this moment on, survival would no longer be passive. It would become a choice. The decision to stay visible changed the direction of everything, but it didn't bring relief. It brought resistance. Once Magic Johnson chose to speak, he stepped into a role no one had prepared him for. He was no longer just managing a diagnosis. He was confronting a society built on fear. The first shift was internal. He stopped waiting for reassurance and started demanding understanding. He learned the science behind HIV. How it was transmitted. How it was not. Facts replaced assumptions. Knowledge replaced panic. The virus was still there, but the unknown no longer controlled his thoughts. That mattered more than people realized. Then came the harder part. Saying the same things out loud. Repeating them. Correcting people who were convinced they already knew the truth. Explaining, again and again, that sharing a quart was not dangerous. That shaking hands was not a threat. That proximity did not equal infection. Each explanation felt like swimming against a current of decades of stigma. Not everyone listened. Some never would. But some did. Slowly, visibly, the temperature changed. Conversations shifted. Fear softened into questions. Questions opened the door to facts. And facts, when repeated enough, began to dismantle the panic that had dominated the narrative. The NBA became the testing ground. When he attempted a return, it wasn't just about basketball. It was about whether institutions were willing to lead or follow fear. The debate was intense. Players were divided. Executives hesitated. Public opinion fluctuated daily. Every practice became a statement. Every appearance became symbolic. He returned briefly, not to prove he was the same player, but to prove he was the same person. Alive. Capable. Present. The reaction was complicated. Applause mixed with anxiety. Respect mixed with uncertainty. But something important happened. The world saw him moving, sweating, competing. Not deteriorating. Not disappearing. That image mattered more than words. It contradicted everything people thought they knew. It forced a reconsideration that statistics alone never could. He wasn't a prediction. He was evidence. Off the court, the work expanded. He spoke to communities that had been ignored. He addressed groups that rarely heard from people who looked like him, spoke like him, or carried the same fears. He talked openly about responsibility without shame. About consequences without judgment. That balance was critical. He didn't frame himself as a victim. He framed himself as accountable. This reframing changed how people listened. He wasn't asking for sympathy. He was offering clarity. He acknowledged his past without glorifying it. He didn't deny mistakes. He contextualized them. And in doing so, he removed the moral hierarchy that often silenced these conversations. The turning point wasn't about redemption. It was about ownership. Owning his story before others could simplify it. Owning his voice before fear could drown it out. Owning his future in a world that had already decided how it would end. There were setbacks. Moments of exhaustion. Days when the weight of being, the example, felt unbearable. He was still managing his health. Still navigating uncertainty. Still aware that survival was not guaranteed. But purpose altered the equation. The days had structure again. The weeks had direction. What surprised him most was how the work changed him. Speaking didn't just educate others. It reshaped how he saw himself. He was no longer defined solely by what had happened to him. He was defined by what he chose to do next. This was the real turning point. Not the diagnosis. Not the press conference. But the shift from defense to direction. From reacting to leading. From surviving privately to confronting publicly. The fear didn't disappear. Courage rarely eliminates fear. It repurposes it. Fear became fuel. Pressure became momentum. The same intensity that once drove him on the court now powered something quieter but far more enduring. He wasn't chasing a comeback. He was building a different kind of legacy. One that didn't rely on physical dominance or applause. One measured in changed minds, reduced stigma, and conversations that finally happened out loud. From here on, his life would never resemble what it once was. That was not the goal. The goal was to ensure that the end of one chapter did not mean the end of the story. And for the first time since that doctor's office, the future didn't feel like a countdown. It felt like a responsibility he was ready to carry. Living past the moment the world expected you to die changes how everything feels. Time becomes deliberate. Choices slow down. Meaning matters more than momentum. For Magic Johnson, survival wasn't a victory lap. It was a responsibility he carried into every room he entered. As years passed, the predictions quietly failed. He didn't fade. He didn't disappear. He adapted. Advances in treatment improved outcomes, but discipline mattered just as much. He rebuilt his life around consistency, health, and limits he had never respected before. The routines that once felt restrictive became protective. The body he once pushed without question now required attention, care, and honesty. Away from the court, a different career emerged. Business replaced basketball as the new arena. He invested, built, and expanded with the same intensity that once defined his game. But this time, success wasn't about dominance. It was about sustainability. Ownership replaced access. Long-term impact replaced short-term reward. The shift mirrored the larger change in his life. Fewer risks. More intention. His public role continued to evolve. He didn't just speak about HIV when cameras were present. He funded research. Supported education. Focused on communities that carried disproportionate risk and received the least attention. He understood that awareness without access changes little. Resources mattered. Representation mattered. Presence mattered. What made his influence different was consistency. He didn't disappear once public interest moved on. He stayed. Year after year. Interview after interview. Quiet meeting after quiet meeting. Over time, the shock softened into respect. The fear that once surrounded his name began to dissolve. Not completely, but enough to change the conversation. He became proof of something the early 90s couldn't imagine. That HIV was not an ending. That a full life was still possible. That dignity could exist alongside illness. That accountability did not require shame. Those messages didn't arrive as slogans. They arrived through longevity. Through visibility. Through the simple fact of his continued presence. The legacy expanded beyond health. He redefined what leadership looked like after loss. He showed that reinvention didn't require denial of the past. It required ownership of it. His story stopped being about what happened to him and became about what he built afterward. For a generation that watched him dominate the court, the later years offered a different lesson. Strength isn't only measured in performance. It's measured in adaptation. In restraint. In the willingness to confront reality without turning away. The smile that once symbolized joy on fast breaks came to represent something quieter. Endurance. Perhaps the most powerful impact was unseen. Countless individuals who received diagnoses of their own and didn't feel as alone. Families who learned instead of panicking. Conversations that became possible because someone had already stood in the open and refused to disappear. History often remembers moments. But legacies are built in what follows. In the decades after the microphone, after the headlines, after the fear peaked and receded, his continued life did something no speech ever could. It normalized survival. He didn't erase the past. He didn't escape consequence. He lived with it. Publicly. Deliberately. And in doing so, he transformed a narrative that once promised only an ending into one that still allowed for growth, contribution, and meaning. By outlasting the expectations placed on him, he forced the world to adjust its assumptions. Not just about HIV, but about resilience. About responsibility. About what it really means to keep going when the story everyone else has written for you says you shouldn't. And that may be the most enduring victory of all. The story of Magic Johnson was never just about basketball. It was about what happens when certainty collapses and identity is stripped down to its core. At 32, he learned that success does not protect you from consequence, and talent does not negotiate with reality. What defines a life is not the absence of failure, but the response to it. He didn't outrun the past. He faced it. He didn't deny responsibility. He accepted it. And instead of allowing fear to finish the story, he chose visibility over silence. That choice didn't remove pain, but it gave pain direction. It turned isolation into impact and uncertainty into purpose. The lesson here is uncomfortable, and that's why it lasts. Life doesn't warn you before it changes. It doesn't wait until you feel ready. Control is fragile. Health is not guaranteed. Time is not promised. But meaning is still available, even after the moment you think everything is over. What magic showed is that resilience isn't loud. It's consistent. It's the decision to show up again when the world expects you to step away. To live deliberately when the future becomes uncertain. To take ownership when excuses would be easier. This isn't a story about beating the odds. It's a story about refusing to disappear. And now the question turns outward. When your life changes without permission, when the story you plan collapses, what will you choose to do next? So what's your story?